committees here. Today we'll go on the House standing committees. You'll see Appropriations Transportation. On that tab, once you click on the committee, you'll click on Documents. From Documents, you'll go down to our current, to the bottom here where it'll say Joint Appropriations on Transportation. From Joint Appropriations on Transportation, you'll see all of our committee documents from past years, and then 2023 session will have today's. And then on it'll be today's date with the introductory meeting. And that'll have our agenda, and my presentation here is number 2 on that list. No problem. So again, just to give a brief outline, we've got talking about our division and the other central staff divisions. Go over fiscal notes and fiscal memos, which you can request for bills that might change expenditures through policy change. Talk about legislative confidentiality and the rules that we and the other central staff divisions abide by. Go over some budget terms and talk about your budget documents that y'all will be producing, and tentative schedule for the next few weeks and few months as well. So starting off talking about the fiscal research division. So General Statute 120-36.1 establishes FRD as an independent staff agency of the General Assembly. So point out that we are nonpartisan and we work with all members of the General Assembly, both House and Senate. And we work with members in helping to develop the state budget for both chambers as well as the conference process. We also analyze budgets and programs which have specific areas that we are assigned to, that we cover and follow along with. We monitor the expenditures of the agency to ensure compliance with the state budget acts, and we look at the way the department is structured and make recommendations to members about potential changes, as well as produce fiscal notes and memos, which again are going to follow along with the policy changes in other non-budget bills. So as I was mentioning, there are 3 nonpartisan professional staff divisions serving all 170 members. We also have the legislative analysis and legislative drafting division. We have 40 FTE for our fiscal research staff. That's divided into 9 teams as well as some support staff. You see on the right several of the teams. Of course, Lisa and I are transportation. We've also got various other area committees, our statewide team that covers salaries, capital, and the state health plan, as well as our budget development that work with the full chairs. So our primary responsibilities during session will be to staff the committees like this, make sure that they're running smoothly and getting those documents uploaded for you all and presenters ready to go. Preparing the budget documents, the committee report and the budget bill with you all. Of course, our fiscal notes and memos, and responding to your requests. So as you have questions that come up that you want to ask, we'll put together answers for those. Just to give a little background, what is a fiscal note or a fiscal memo? Those are 5-year analyses of all estimated fiscal impacts of a bill. You can see down there on the slide kind of what one looks like that's changing the expenditures related to a policy change. And so those are prepared upon member requests, and they are confidential on the note side until the note is published. A memo is the same type of analysis, usually for a draft bill or a PCS, and that's going to remain confidential after it's completed. If you have fiscal note requests, those should be emailed to the at FRD-fiscal note requests in your Outlook, and you make sure to include the requester's name, the bill number or a draft number if it's a memo that's related to a PCS or a draft, as well as the short title of the bill. And then our website, just point this out for you all and make sure you have this link, sites.nclag.gov/FRD. That's where you're going to find our past committee reports and budget actions that have been taken in detail if you want to go into and see what was done in past years. There'll also be fiscal briefs and facts that'll summarize the actions of previous General Assemblies. Revenue forecasts that'll show, at least for past years right now, what the anticipated revenues for the various funds are, as well as a staff directory, so you'll see who covers what in terms of various areas of the budget from a staff perspective. Briefly mention here the legislative drafting division. On the budget side here, Joshua Freeman is the lead on legislative drafting. I've got his kind of coverages there posted with some bolds for the things that are related to, the might be related to Department of Transportation. And he's going to be working with us throughout the budget process and putting the budget bill, helping you all put the budget bill together. And then Brian also helps with DMV related issues related to drafting with the Department of Transportation. And then we also have the Legislative Analysis Division linked here. They're going to be the staff for your policy committee for transportation and any other policy committees that are meeting. I want to stress this point about confidentiality. So all requests made to fiscal staff, legislative drafting, and legislative analysis are confidential between the member and staff, and the member's office and staff. If you're asking us for something, we won't. We will keep that confidential between us, and it will also be. We won't acknowledge the existence of the request unless we are given specific guidance by the members, by the member who's requesting to share that with others. And our requests to agencies are not confidential unless they're directly related to a fiscal note. So the agency may acknowledge the existence of the request unless it is directly related to a fiscal note. But just want to stress confidentiality there. Talk briefly about some budgeting terms. So you hear these words thrown around a lot. Appropriation, that's an enactment by the General Assembly authorizing the withdrawal of funds from the state treasury, and that's follows along with what's in the North Carolina Constitution. No money shall be drawn from the state treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law. Some other terms we'll hear a lot are requirements. So that's going to be all the agency's budget for a fiscal year, and that's going to be all tallying up all the expenditures. Total receipts will include those sources of funds that are brought in for the operations of an agency. And net appropriations is just the difference between requirements and receipts, and that's going to be what's coming out of, in this committee's case, the Highway Fund and Highway Trust Fund after the receipts are accounted for to the expenditures. Going to produce a couple of budget documents. So you've got three shown here. We've got House, Senate, as well as conference. Committee report, that'll be a term that we'll use a lot as well, and that's going to show every line item expenditure that the that each budget bill contains it related to Department of Transportation, as well as all of the various departments and divisions throughout the state. And that's going to show you every single expenditure that's made. The budget bill will follow along, contain policy related to the budget as well as other policy items, and so you'll have two of those. You'll have a budget bill and a committee report from the House, from the Senate, and then a conference where they'll come together. So those are those basic documents. And again, if you want to see past versions of this, you can go on the FRD website and look at the previous ones. Just to briefly discuss some next steps for this committee. This committee is meeting Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays at 8:30 a.m. subject to changes, but it's essentially meeting over the next 3 weeks until March 2nd. There's going to be some staff presentations as well as agency presentations for y'all to look forward to. We're having the staff overview today along with the review of the DOT budget that Lisa's going to go through. Next week, I'll be presenting the forecast for the Highway Fund and the Highway Trust Fund in this committee, and answering any questions you may have about that. And then we'll also have presentations, including but not limited to the Division of Highways, the Division of Motor Vehicles, the CFO from DOT, Ferry Division, Facilities Management, the Ports Authority, and the Turnpike Authority, as well as some others. Just to lay out a tentative timeline looking forward past these meetings, we've got the House and Senate. I've got kind of just February, March, House, Senate, Governor, what's going on between each of these. So the House and Senate will receive these will, as you meet in your committee here, will receive presentations about relevant agencies or topics while the governor is finishing off the base budget and recommended budget. On the 21st, you'll hear in full appropriations the consensus forecast presented. And then the following day, I'll go into more detail about the highway fund and highway trust fund in this committee. After that, after this wraps up on the 2nd, you'll have a couple things happening. You'll have the House beginning to work on its budget. The House is going first in this biennium. So you'll also have the governor coming over and presenting his recommended budget, tentatively scheduled for March 15th. And the governor's office will present that through OSBM. Looking forward to April and June. More tentative. The passing of the budget. The Senate and the Senate will begin work after the House finishes its budget and pass its own budget. Then the conference process will begin, and finally the budget will pass. So that's what you're looking forward to over the next 4 months. Mm-hmm. 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 So the committee website is linked to here as well. I showed you how to get there a little bit ago to find these documents, but you can also use the link that's in this presentation if you want to bookmark that. It is a paperless committee, so everything will be posted on here as well as if there's follow-up questions for today, we'll post the answers to that in the folder for this meeting. There'll be a link to the live stream as well as any agency reports that are relevant to the topic at hand. And finally, contact information for us. We have the Fiscal Research Division's phone number. If you have any question, you're not sure where to direct it, just give FRD a call. We've also got Lisa Hollowell, our team leader, contact information and my contact information as well. So thank you very much.
You'll hold your questions until after the next presentation. Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Lisa Hollowell with the Fiscal Research Division. So the other half of the team, we are in the process of recruiting and hiring, so we will have a third member of the team shortly. This presentation is going to include on slide number 2, the history and governance of the Department of Transportation, the major responsibilities of the department as outlined in the general statute, the different funds that support the activities of the department. We'll look at the budget, revenues, and expenditures, and also some exceptions to the State Budget Act and what makes the Department of Transportation different from the other general fund agencies and how they operate and budget and so forth. I also have some information in here on cash and spending and how North Carolina compares to other states in terms of generating its revenues, which is always interesting. And we'll look at the organizational divisions. Hopping over to page 4, there's a lot of dates on here, and I'm just going to try to hit the high notes on this one. In 1915, the first full-fledged State Highway Commission was created with its 7 members. And that started the process of having a governance board aside from just being the executive branch overseeing Department of Transportation. In the 20s and early 30s during the Great Depression is when the General Assembly authorized takeover of all of the county roads. So at that time, there were about 5,500 of those roads, and so the General Assembly said take those over, and also prohibited counties from participating in funding for various projects. At the same time, this is when the highway fund was created with a motor fuels tax, and also a bond was issued. So the counties were prohibited from participating for many years. The General Assembly ultimately did reverse that, but counties don't participate in the road system in North Carolina in any significant manner. In 1951 is when the Aid to Municipalities was enacted, the Powell Bill. This was from a senator, sponsored by a senator from Whiteville, Julius Powell, along with some others and the League of Municipalities, in trying to get that aid out to the cities and towns. He had been prior mayor. So the Powell bill was enacted, and this was a dedicated amount of 1/2 cent per gallon of the motor fuels tax, which equated to about, at that time, $4.5 million that went out to the cities and towns. And there were a little over 300 participants in the first Powell bill. Now there are over 500 towns and municipalities. So in the 1980s was the creation of the Highway Trust Fund. And that was very specific and required in law that it would be for the completion of the interstate system, as well as the creation of the 7 urban loops, and to pave dirt roads and throughout the state. And in order to fund this, the General Assembly allowed what had been a 2% sales tax on vehicles to be deposited into the Highway Trust Fund as a highway use tax, and raised it from 2% to 3% with a cap of $1,000. And then the cap was raised to $1,500, and then ultimately the cap went away. And in turn, the Highway Trust Fund was to repay the general fund for its loss of revenue. So for many years, the Highway Trust Fund paid back to the general fund $170 million. It ultimately was a lot more than that. It was hundreds of millions of dollars that went from the Highway Trust Fund to the general fund for that repayment and other things as the General Assembly saw fit to make those transfers. In 2002, the Turnpike Authority was created, and in 2008, the General Assembly provided gap funding for the Turnpike project. So the difference in the debt service that the Turnpike had to make and the revenues and tolls that were received. So the gap funding is $49 million and will continue on for many years. In 2013, the General Assembly eliminated what had been the equity formula that was created with the Highway Trust Fund, where the funds had gone out based upon population and completion of those interstate roads and so forth, and put it in a different way. And so now sending the funds out differently based upon a transportation improvement program, which is a 10-year schedule of construction projects throughout the state. That planning effort is generated at, probably as you know, at the local level through the metropolitan planning organizations and the rural planning organizations. And 40% of all of the funds go for those statewide roads of significance, and then 30% regional and 30% at the division level. In 2015, the General Assembly eliminated the transfers of the funds to the general fund. So those got the $170 million and the rest of them. There are still a few transfers, but it's mainly those things that are related to either the collection of the motor fuels tax to the Department of Revenue, to the Department of Agriculture for the inspection of the motor fuels facilities and installations, and so forth. And fines and forfeitures, that's a huge amount that's transferred out to a pot of funds that get appropriated for educational purposes. In 2020, the board was restructured and they were given more responsibilities. And in 2022, the reverse happened, where now the sales tax collections that had been deposited into the general fund, 2%, is now going to the highway fund. And that will escalate to 6% and a split of the highway fund and the highway trust fund. So that's a little bit about educational purposes.
History.
In 2020, the board was
Moving on to
restructured and they were given more responsibilities. And in 2022, the reverse happened. In 2020, the Board of Transportation was increased from 19 members to 20 members. There are 14 appointees by the governor, 6 appointees by the General Assembly, and there has to be representation from each of the 14 highway divisions, but no more than the Secretary of Transportation is an ex officio non-voting member. So the duties did increase to provide oversight of transportation finances, really to serve as a fiduciary for those highway fund and highway trust fund dollars, managing the money and the property that is owned by the department. It also, the board must review and approve each of the spending plans, which was implemented in 2020 as well. So because the Department of Transportation is different and it's got its own funds with the highway fund and the highway trust fund, they're always having to create, their spending plan, because if the revenues are not materializing, they've got to have a plan in place for that. But what the General Assembly did was say, make this a public document, make sure that the board is approving it. The Office of State Budget and Management has to approve it. So everybody knows what the spending will be for that particular year. The board approves the schedule for all of the construction program and the maintenance programs, not the particularly individual projects, but the schedule of that. And they review and approve the use of the bonds and the federally funded projects. Then moving over to the trust funds. And this is on page 9. So there are two major state transportation funds that pay for all of the activities within the Department of Transportation. It's the Highway Fund and the Highway Trust Fund. I think about the Highway Fund as funding like all of the operations within the department, as well as maintaining the entire road network throughout the state. That's primarily done through those local highway divisions. And then it pays for the operations of all the modes and the aids that go out in the form to local public transportation systems, to airports, and so forth. So that's the Highway Fund. It also, the Powell bill is within that particular fund. The Highway Trust Fund funds primarily that state transportation improvement program, that 10-year schedule of activities. So that's the Highway Trust Fund primarily. Also, the Highway Trust Fund pays for the debt service for the build and C bonds and provides the gap funding for the Turnpike Authority and aid to the North Carolina Ports Authority. The budget for 22-23 looks like this. The way that this is laid out is what Nick was talking about earlier with requirements, receipts, and net appropriations. So this shows the year. The first line is the Highway Fund, the second one, the Highway Trust Fund, and then you have the total certified budget. You have the requirements for the Highway Fund at $4.8 billion. The receipts of 1.9 is primarily those federal receipts, and then a net appropriations of 2.9. The Highway Trust Fund has an amount of 1.8 billion for a total net appropriation of 4.7 billion from the Highway Fund and Highway Trust Fund for the current year. And the department has over 11,000 full-time equivalent positions. Looking specifically at the Highway Fund, the pie here shows that over 66% of the funds are used for maintenance and small construction. So that's for the paving of the road system, the maintenance that's involved. Roadside environmental is in that. Also, the small construction program for spot safety and mobility enhancements. Roadside environmental is included there. Also, the bridge program and bridge preservation and paving. All of that makes up the 66%. And then you have the modes at about 13% of this pie. Or about $340 million. You've got the Powell bill at 5% of the Highway Fund, and then administration. There is a chunk showing up there for reserves, transfer, and others of 185. So this is where there's a lot of things in this. The amount of funds that go out for civil fines and forfeitures, that's over 60 or $70 million. Estimated, so that's a transfer out. The Department of Revenue gets about 6 million, Department of Agriculture about 6 million. And then the legislative salary increases are showing up here before they get distributed out to the divisions, and some other increases that were made by the General Assembly for benefits. So that will look a little different after those are dispersed out. The Highway Trust Fund, almost 90% of the funds go for the statewide transportation improvement program. And then you have the debt service showing up there at 93 million. That's going to increase to about 120 million moving forward for the build and see. And then those other disbursements that go out. Also within the Highway Trust Fund would be funding for the visitor centers at 640,000. That was increased this past year at a couple $100,000. So that is showing up there. Here's a look at the 10-year actual expenditures. So in general, expenditures increased over this past 10 years. It continued to increase up until the pandemic, and it dropped back a little bit. The highway fund in yellow is the primary drop back from 2018-19 to 2019-20. 2018-19, you see they peaked at spending of about 6.6 billion. I want to mention this is taken from the CAFR, so these are the year-end reports that's created by the Office of State Controller and audited by the state auditor. So there was a drop back there. A lot happened in 18-19. There was a concerted effort by the department to expedite projects and get projects and get their spending down a bit, because the Build NC had just been passed by the General Assembly. But in order for the department to go after and get these bonds issued, they had to have their cash down below $1 billion. So for whatever reason, there was a lot of expenditures going out during 18-19. So that at the end of that year, they were their cash was very low. The General Assembly ended up providing a couple of $100 million that transferred from the general fund into the highway fund and to help out. They went ahead and issued their first Build NC bond at the end of 18-19. So you've got the and then the Garvey was issued at that time as well. But you see the pandemic, the dip of 1920, because there were about 4 months of pandemic showing up in that fiscal year. And then 2021, you had the full year of the pandemic. 21-22, expenditures are getting back up there to 6.4 billion. And then with the highway fund and highway trust fund receipts, thank you. So here you're seeing the same thing. Revenues are increasing on average of about 2.3% annually. A bit of a drop back there in 1920 and 2021, but not to the extent that you saw with the expenditures. Again, in 2018-19, you're seeing these receipts bumped up a bit because of the receipts that were transferred over. Also the Build NC. And during these years, 19, 20, and 21 is when the General Assembly changed the motor fuels tax contribution, put a little bit more into the highway fund and less into the highway trust fund to bump up the highway fund, because that's where the spending deficit was occurring. And then to mention another piece of the big funding pot, the Build NC bonds, again, passed in 2018, Session Law 2018-16. And this is over a 10-year period. It's a $3 billion amount that the department can get issued. The cap is $300 million each year, unless the General Assembly acts, and they did for 2021 and allowed that to be $700 million. There are several restrictions to the program. You know, their cash DOT has to have a cash balance down below $1 billion. For the 21-22 issuance, the General Assembly allowed that cash to be up to $2 billion, and so made a change. They did not go after a bond this past year. They've got a healthy fund balance right now, which could be part of the reason, but also their cash, they didn't meet their cash requirement of being below the $2 billion in order to have the bonds for this current year. And so for the Garvey bonds, those are bonds that are issued and paid for by future federal funds. So it doesn't count against the transportation funds in terms of how much debt can be issued. It is separate. It's paid for by the federal funds. The restriction there is that debt service may not exceed 20% of those federal revenues, and it's well under that. Their debt service is $154 million on that, and they've got outstanding debt of about $1.2 billion. And the other major source of funds comes from the federal aid. Most of the federal aid that comes into North Carolina has a matching requirement of about 20%, and also it's on a reimbursement basis. So the department has to go and spend the money in order to before they can get the funds in. But there are a couple of exceptions to that. The funds that come in for the Appalachian Highway, there's no match for that, even though it has to be still programmed in the STIP. So the major sources of fund for the Federal Highway Trust Fund, separate from the state trust fund, is a motor fuels tax. It's a gasoline tax of 18.4 cents per gallon, and the diesel is 24.4 cents per gallon, and that hasn't been increased at the federal level since 1993. And then 12% comes from other sales of large trucks and tires and so forth. I want to mention IIJA, which is the Investments and Infrastructure Act that was passed in 2022 at the federal level. That's bringing additional funds into North Carolina, about $400 million on an annual basis. And just looking in total at when you look at all of the receipts that the department has to work with for 22-23, if you're counting that the Bill NC and Garvey's are about $450 million, which at the end of June of last year, they had about $552 million. We don't know, how that spending is going to be, but they have over $7 billion, with 33% of this pie coming from the motor fuels tax. Then you have 27% of federal funds, the highway use tax 15%, and then the license and registration and so forth that goes through DMV at 15%. And here's a chart that we've historically put together. Also, the department puts together, and it updates and updated this for you. And that just shows the highway fund on the left and the highway trust fund on the right, and how those funds flow and what they pay for. Really just a repeat of what I've already talked about. So the exceptions to the State Budget Act. And what makes DOT different? Well, one is that all of the interest that's earned on their funds, the highway fund and the highway trust fund, and when they have a large cash balance, the interest is going to be higher. Everything is made available for y'all to appropriate for the Department of Transportation. Also, the main savings reserve statute that other agencies are able to tap during emergencies, they don't apply to the Department of Transportation. So DOT, the General Assembly, created an emergency reserve for DOT in 2019, and it's $125 million, and that can be used when there's a presidential declared emergency. The department can just go right ahead and use it. They are to also maximize the federal receipts that may come in for the emergency. And then the DOT secretary is to notify the governor if it gets depleted, so that the governor and the General Assembly can make a change if needed. Also, another unique aspect is that the highway fund can overdraft. And the General Statute 136-1610 states that at the beginning of a fiscal year, the CFO must eliminate all of the overdrafts on state maintenance and construction projects. So here's an example in the current year. You've got the maintenance program of $1.7 billion on the left, and then you have the overdrafts that are covered by the 23 Appropriation Authority. So right off the bat, you've got the 1.7, and then they're covering their overdrafts. Other state agencies that are general fund agencies cannot do that for its projects and contracts. So the transportation projects and contracts, it's not explicitly defined in the law. So it includes maintenance and construction, but also other things. Number 4 on this states that a project or a contract, it may comprise last year's appropriations, the current year's appropriations, and also future appropriations in developing that contract. That is very different than other state agencies. Other state agencies, when at the end of the fiscal year, if they have money left over, that becomes reversions, and then the General Assembly reappropriates that. But so this is a unique exception for the Department of Transportation. Also, their projects and contracts may be completely encumbered in the fiscal year of appropriations, regardless of when that period of performance is. So that is one of the reasons that the General Assembly decided to have a spend plan and make it a public spend plan, so that they could see where the spending is occurring in the various line items of which y'all are appropriating. Credit balance and credit reserve is another category that makes DOT unique. So the credit balance and reserve is the unreserved funds on the last day of the fiscal year. That's unallotted and unencumbered. And that applies to most of the modes, and certain construction programs. And it can also be remaining balances of certain inactive projects. So there's a credit balance that is out there, and DOT has the ability to utilize the credit balance in certain ways. If there's an urgent road construction project and the secretary and chief operating officer feel like that something needs to be done, they've got that ability to do it. And then if it exceeds $5 million, then the rest of it goes into the general maintenance reserve account. Ferries is the exception. The General Assembly put in place an annual budget for the ferry division, up the amount that the ferry division receives so that it's adequately funded, and then created a special fund. Whereas if the ferry division has money left over at the end of the year, that gets transferred into the special fund to pay for the future ferry capital needs. Also, the department is allowed to make adjustments to the budget if there are snow and ice emergencies that are non-presidential declared emergencies, and that they can go in and reduce all of their line items. They actually did this in 2020, and they even reduced the Powell bill. And the next year, the General Assembly directed that the Powell bill not be reduced. Okay, cash and spending. The spend plan is actually their cash span plan for their expenditures that is approved by the board and also by the Office of State Budget and Management. It's to be based upon the appropriations by the General Assembly, and it includes all of their funds. And the Office of State Budget and Management is to report any disapprovals or objections that DOT has developed with its spend plan, and we haven't seen any of those disapprovals. The statute requires that DOT have a cash balance of 7.5% on a monthly basis. So this is down to the month that they're to have a cash balance of 7.5%, not to go below it. If they were to drop below it, then they were going to have certain restrictions on contracting. Currently, that's about $350 million. So it's 7.5% based upon all of the appropriations of the Highway Fund and the Highway Trust Fund. And then the general statute states that the target spending is between 700 and 900 million, or 15 to 20% of that appropriations. They are also to report monthly when the target isn't met. And also there's a cash watch report that the department provides to y'all. So every Friday you get a cash watch report from the department to show how much they started with for the week, how much in revenues came in, how the disbursements looked for the whole week, and then what's their reserve cash and what's their unreserved cash. The February cash balance of the unreserved is at 2.3 billion. So that's about 49% of the appropriations. The year-end cash balances. So the law requires this cash, this cash floor on a monthly basis. What I've put together for you here is the year-end balances and also the February 2023. So the bottom line, the bottom blue line, is the highway fund. And you see over on the left, the 350, which is the floor. So in 1819, you see that the highway fund dipped with their cash. This is just the year-end reports. And then in 2021, the cash came back. The red line is the Highway Trust Fund. So following out the Highway Trust Fund, you see dipping in those same years also. And the Highway Trust Fund loaned the Highway Fund some money during that time, over $1 billion, in order to keep the operations going out at the local highway divisions. So that's what that line looks like, the red one. And then you see the total line at the top with the cash where it is February. Looking at February with a year end isn't exactly an apples to apples comparison, but I wanted you to just see how the cash fell, because these are just year end. It's not looking at month to month when DOT's cash got very, very low. That would be within the fiscal year. So this is just the year end. When the CFO comes over, Stephanie King, she's going to be also providing you what that cash is going to look like going forward and what their projections are. How North Carolina funding compares with other states. Okay, so we tend to compare North Carolina's transportation system with Texas because Texas has the largest and North Carolina has the second largest, and then our surrounding states and also Florida. So looking here, you see that North Carolina stands out because it owns 74% of its total road system throughout the state. That's an anomaly when looking at the other states because on a national level, that's 19%. So we're like Texas in that we own very large systems, but Texas owns only 25% of its system and North Carolina 74%. We're very similar to Virginia, and they own 78% of its systems. And then you see the other states are falling there at lower amounts. How does the funding look? Well, you see that Texas reported, and this report comes from the Federal Highway Administration's report from 2020. So this is a snapshot in time and it's not the most recent. They lag behind a bit, but this has looked about the same over the past 10 years. You've got Texas spending almost 3 times as much as North Carolina. North Carolina's falling in about the middle of the pack in the amount of funds that it spent in 1 year, even though Texas and North Carolina have about the same size road system that it's maintaining. The funding for the highways, I mean, it really does vary. It's based upon, geography and history of these states and the divide of local versus state. So there's a lot of nuances to this data that I don't know, but this is just the report from the Federal Highway Administration. The motor fuels tax. Looking at the comparison states, North Carolina is the highest of these comparison states and also well above the national average. The motor fuels tax is currently set at 40.5 cents per gallon, and North Carolina sets the gasoline and diesel at the very same level. Some states have set it a little bit differently. On the national average, the diesel is a little bit higher. The national average of diesel is 30.84. And the gas is 29.54. In 2015, the General Assembly modified how the motor fuels tax rate is set. So it's based upon a formula. Every year, it's at the end of the year, around October, it's calculated for the next year. And it's based upon population and the consumer price index for energy. 1 cent of motor fuels tax yields about 63 million in revenues, and that's from all the fuels on average. One thing to note on this one is that Georgia had suspended its motor fuels tax up until around January the 10th, and then they put theirs back in place. So that's the rate that you're seeing there is what they picked back up with on the 11th. Also, South Carolina, over the past 3 years, they had increased their motor fuels tax about 2 cents each year and up until 2022.
Mr. Chair. There was something I thought we might need to mention now. If Lisa could tell us that several of these states were already getting funds from the general fund, and we didn't until a few years ago start getting funds. Can you speak to that just briefly?
If I can modify that, actually, general fund money in some of these states, the counties build roads.
Right.
Right near me, Horry County, South Carolina, they have a penny sales tax extra that pays for roads inside the county. Our counties don't build roads. So this isn't all the money going to those states. It just the state portion.
I thought that was something members would like to know, because like in Virginia, the counties still build roads in Virginia and South Carolina.
Lisa, you want to?
So anyway.
Yes, sir. Looking here at the funding, you do see the local funds have been identified in this report. It's typically a very small amount of the state-controlled systems, even with these comparison states. But because the state's owning and controlling a smaller percentage, then of course the locals are, having to do more than certainly North Carolina. The other one is the highway use tax. So this is the 3% of the vehicle price, net the trade-in allowance. It generates about $1 billion annually. 1% yields about $360 million. North Carolina is low for this region, whereas they were high for the motor fuels tax. They're the lowest of this region. in looking at these, except South Carolina for their vehicles over 16,700, because they have a maximum amount of 500. And again, these last two, the motor fuels tax and the highway use tax, this is how this has looked for the last 10 years. The next is the regular private vehicle registration fees. This is paid annually. In North Carolina is $38.75. This registration fee is on a quadrennial adjustment and will be adjusted for the second year of the biennium. The first adjustment was in 2020. A few things to note here. One thing that looks different than a couple years ago is Virginia. Virginia has a rate between or an amount between $30.75 and $35.75, and then on top of that you pay more the more efficient in gas your vehicle is. So it starts at, if your vehicle is, gets 25 miles per gallon or more, then that's $6, and all the way up to $61 if it gets 50 miles per gallon. So I've talked with him a bit this past week about that, and apparently this is brand new and everybody's learning about it, and you may see some changes on that. And North Carolina here falls about in the middle of these comparison states. Also in North Carolina, there are a few counties that have an add-on, Durham and Orange and Wake, as well as Randolph has a $1. Okay, here's the DMV fees for electric vehicles, and this is an additional registration fee to what you just saw on the page before. So the states that I found that has it, of the comparison states, you have Georgia at $211, Tennessee a flat 100, North Carolina is $140.25, and that will be adjusted with a quadrennial increase for the second year. South Carolina $120 and Virginia $116, in addition to the other one. DOT organizations, the Division of Highways is the largest, about 1.9 billion is going out to maintain the road system throughout the state. And you see the 14 highway divisions, and it has the most FTE of any of the divisions at 7,800. The Division of Motor Vehicles, 176.3 million, receipts of about 45 million. Some of those receipts are end up being the fines and forfeitures and transferred out. But of course, DMV is under DOT in North Carolina. In some states, it's separate and structured differently. And of course, the driver license and ID cards are issued through them, the vehicle titles and registrations, and the law enforcement under their License and Theft Bureau. Also, hearings is within DMV. Regarding the modes, there's about 600 full-time equivalent positions with these various divisions within DOT. The total amount of funding, $517 million, and a lot of that is going out through grants administration, through aid to either public transit systems or airports and short line railroads and so forth. Also, it includes the rail service that's operated, the Piedmont service through the rail division, planning and technical assistance that's provided by all of these divisions, data management, and in total about 12 or 13% of the highway fund. And some recent legislative actions that have been taken. The big one was the current year where the transfer of the 2% of the sales tax to the highway fund. In 23-24, that will increase to 4% and then 6% in 24-25 and after. So ultimately, I think that's calculated to be over $600 million that will go to the transportation funds. This past year, the General Assembly put in $135 million non-recurring for cost escalation to try to handle the inflation that was affecting those contracts that had been issued before March 1st of 2022. The department came up with a mechanism to for the contractors to request some additional funds, and there was about 144 million requested, and the last report I received was 72 million verified to be eligible, and there may be some in appeals right now. But Joey Hopkins will be here tomorrow and you can get some more information on that one. Right-of-way acquisition, the General Assembly put 109 million to try to, all of the projects that got delayed in 1819, there were hundreds of projects due to the low cash problem. And then also when the pandemic hit, created delays as well. And to try to help the owners of these properties that were that had land that was going to be affected through right of way, the 109 was put in, and the department hasn't spent any of those funds to date, but they are trying to determine if there are any claims that could be eligible under the law. So y'all may want to think about moving forward what tweaks could be done to try to help get those funds out there. The commercial airports grant that was increased to 100 million from 75 million. And those are the funds that go out to the commercial airports. And then the infrastructure and infrastructure investments and Job Act funding, the additional funds from the federal government, that was about 340 million for the current year for highways and transit and airports and so forth. Also, the last couple of slides here is showing the Turnpike Authority, the certified budget that's included in the North Carolina accounting system. And Mr. Chairman, the Ports Authority is the last one here, and the Global Transport. And I just jumped through those, but I'm happy to take some questions, Nick and I both, if y'all have some.
Okay, couple of comments before we get into questions. If you'll go, when you go to page 18 and print that out, you'll have the answer to 90% of your questions to your constituents about where the funds come from and go to. That's what we call the cheat sheet. But it really breaks it down on what comes from motor fuels tax, DMV fees, highway use tax. And in North Carolina, the highway use tax is 3%, which is really low compared to most states. And that's when you buy a vehicle, and it's net of the trade. So if you get a $30,000 car and you trade in a $20,000 car, you're only paying the 3% on the difference. So that's a little different from most states. And that's something we've looked at every budget. Couple of questions that, so I have one more question about, actually I want to ask to expound on the gap funding. That is bonds against future federal revenues. And how is that generally used? Just in the Turnpike Authority, or is that used otherwise? Nick?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, so the gap funding that is I believe 49 million that comes out of the highway trust fund to the Turnpike Authority, and that is essentially covering the gap between bonds and the total cost of the projects. That's just for Turnpike Authority.
And how I get Garvey bonds confused with that? Is that the same thing or different?
Mr. Chairman, the Garvey bonds are used for STIP projects and specifically federal projects. And so that is paid for by future federal funds. But those are the projects that would be identified in the STIP.
Mr. Chairman, if we could get the staff, when they're using an acronym to explain, because we got people that are broadcasting too, so they'll know. We're talking sometimes in foreign languages with these acronyms, so everybody will know what we're talking about. So if she would go back and say what Garvey and GAP and all that,
Yeah, Lisa, can you explain some of the acronyms? Usually we start the budget with the chairs, we get a little book of acronyms that we have to memorize. By the way, there'll be a quiz on all this shortly.
Mr. Chairman, we're looking up to see exactly what Garvey stands for. So I apologize.
President Shepherd?
Oh, it would be worth mentioning to some on our committee this morning when we were talking about the transfer from DOT to general funds. Years ago, the State Highway Patrol fell under the Department of Transportation, and then they were moved under JPS, or Justice and Public Safety. And at that time, for several years, we still paid for them or transferred money from DOT to cover the Highway Patrol, but then that ended. So I just wanted to explain that so people know basically what most of that money was doing there. It was the highway patrol that we supported.
And that was about 250 million starting out when we transferred that to the Justice and Public Safety. We had a new member join us in transit. Senator, would you introduce yourself? We introduced each other. Would you introduce yourself?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Senator Natalie Murdoch out of Durham County, South Durham and all of Chatham County. But this feels like home. Many moons ago, I was a transportation planner in Division 13 and 14. So thrilled to be here with all of you this morning.
Great. Yeah, we hope to have your experience in here. And we had a clerk join us. Ethan, would you introduce yourself? And who you clerk for?
I'm Ethan. I am the clerk, legislative assistant for Representative Shepherd.
Okay, further questions? Chairman McGinnis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And if we could get the staff to give a little further explanation on page 38, the total number of FTEs at 7857. Do we have other FTEs authorized but not employed or that sort of thing?
Nick?
Senator McGinnis, last I checked, the vacancy rate was staying around 22%. So that would be, off the top of my head, about 1,600. That 1,600. No, this is the FTE includes all vacant and filled positions.
Okay.
So that is inclusive of. So whatever that minus, the vacancies would be the amount that they currently have in the FTE.
So I saw another figure in their presentation of 11,000. What's the difference between 11,000 and the
That's where I'm coming from, Mr. Chair.
7,800? What's the difference?
The 11,000, Mr. Chair, was for the entire department. This is just for the Division of Highways
Okay.
Oh, okay.
out through the local 14 divisions.
Follow up.
And Garvey,
Follow up, Senator McGinnis.
Go ahead and let her finish.
All right, go ahead and finish, please.
Garvey stands for the Grants Anticipated Revenue Vehicle.
Okay. Senator McGinnis.
Over on page 17, it shows in the 22-23 budget investment income, and that 3, I'm assuming, represents 3 million.
Mr. Chair, yes,
Lisa.
yes, that does represent that.
Okay, so back 2 years ago and up until late, the federal fund rate was near zero. And the federal fund rate, I just noticed that the feds pay at the bank window for participating banks is now 4.65%. Is there any way that we can capture some of that interest rate that's being paid by the Fed on our money as a daily sweep or something like that? Or is that authorized by legislation, or is this money invested? My question is, why are we only getting $3 million on a budget of 7.154 billion, excuse me?
Okay, is any staff member attack that? You're above my head already.
Mr. Chairman, this was what was put into the forecast. So this is, the 3 was taken from the forecast. The actual amount may be a little different, and anything that is generated does provide, it's a source of funding for the department.
Follow up.
Follow up.
So Lisa, do we have a number as far as an interest rate that we're able to participate in? I'm sure it's a fluctuating number based on some movement of the federal rate or either the federal government. But if it's 4.65 and we got a daily sweep or had the availability of a daily sweep, we would be talking about significant money. So follow up on that.
Nick?
Yes, Senator McGinnis. So as Lisa was saying, the budget amount is different from what has actually been collected, and those numbers have been a lot higher so far this year. The state treasurer manages the cash and invests that cash. So using typically, short and long term bond, treasuries to manage to gain those investments. That number has gone up a lot. But it does lag what the federal funds rate is, because they have, longer term investments from before at a lower rate and things like that. So typically it lags the investment that you'll see at the federal funds rate, but eventually to catch up with it.
Final follow-up.
Final
Mr.
follow.
Chairman, if we could have the treasurer to come give us a report at one of our meetings that we're having as to what this is looking like for now and for the foreseeable future, because this could be a significant amount of money that we could put to work rather than just letting it fall into the pool and potentially fall through the cracks, if you will, so that we could get some additional opportunities out of this money. Thank you.
Okay, I think we can invite the treasurer and see if he'll come.
Yep.
So can the staff make a note of that? Thank you, sir. Senator Lazar?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have one.
I tell you, we got these new lights on here. When you request a question, go ahead and turn on your light and make it easier for this old guy to see it. Senator Lazar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is there a limit on the overspending that we talked about earlier that they have to clear up at the end of the year, or is it whatever it is?
That's a good question. Lisa, do I have an answer?
Do they have
on
any
that?
limitations?
Overspending,
Mr. Chair, there,
overdraft, I guess.
the overdrafting, there isn't a total amount. There isn't a limit to it. The auditor did a report back in 2019 and it identified several hundred million that had been overdrafted within the highway fund. So the overdrafts are just covered at the first of the fiscal year, and that's how it's being done right now.
Okay, I got a follow up to that, actually. Is that covered by funds that come in by the end of the fiscal year or covered by funds that are coming in after the beginning of the next fiscal year? Do we know?
It depends. The appropriations, if they're overspending their appropriations, that is their appropriations level and not the cash. So it's covered by the next year's appropriations.
Difference between cash flow and appropriations.
Yes,
Okay.
Follow up,
Senators are,
is that because projects are accelerated, or is it just overspending on the actual project?
yeah, is that acceleration or is that inflation? Or do we know?
Mr. Chairman, it was a lot of different things that it could be. But it's not necessarily project-based. It could be just overspending with local highway divisions. Maybe one local highway division overspent in their roadside environmental, maybe another one overspent in their pavement preservation. So they take it all the way down to the local highway division. If that one local highway division overspends, their next year allocation is adjusted. One underspends, they get to carry forward that authority to the next year.
Does that answer the question partially?
Thank you.
Representative Loftus.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, staff, for the information today. I'm new to this committee. So what impact does this committee have in addressing DMV offices across the state that are still locked up due to COVID, that are still understaffed, and that there's hours of waiting for the public outside in the rain, outside in the sun? What impact can this committee make on addressing that issue? And I've had the commissioner in my office 2.5 hours who played me the song and dance of understaffing and COVID. How do we fix that to take care of our citizens' needs across the state?
I can address halfway and I'll depend on the staff a little bit too. Every year we have budgeted basically what DMV has asked for. And again, I can't explain their operation day to day or even year to year, how they get into these situations where you're short staffed. I think the hiring and the pool available to qualified people might be part of it. However, that should be clearing up after COVID. But can the staff address that as to what we do with DMV?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, DMV is under the purview of this committee, and y'all set the budget for it. If you decide you want to put more funding in for one thing or another, whether it's personnel or more offices, then that's within y'all's purview. The commissioner is coming on Thursday to speak to y'all and talk about some of his initiatives as well as his IT projects.
Cool. Follow up, Mr. Chair.
Follow up.
On the second question, what options are available from this committee to address in my district, in my town, there was a plan by DOT to put in, proposed a 5-lane, 2 ways and then a turn lane in the middle. However, that's now blossomed into a divided highway with greenway in the middle with 40-foot or 20-foot on each side bike paths on a major thoroughfare road over and above what DOT has recommended. How can that be addressed when the existing business owners and residential folks who live along this route will totally be displaced by something that wants to be more aesthetically pleasing, but is well over budget with all these Michigan lefts, the safe turn lefts? The fire department goes a quarter of a mile to turn and come back north. So I'm anxious to find out how we can impact that. I don't need the Cadillac model. A 5-lane will address the need. How do I help them?
I feel your pain. Highway 17 down where I live is becoming a Michigan nightmare to some degree, although it is a safety issue too. However, we do have an impact usually at the division level on the changing scope. It depends on whether it's a state project, regional or division. Sometimes the NPO and RPO has an impact on that. And other times it's a state project, they probably would not have much impact on that. So the staff help with that, what impact this committee would have on that? Or did I explain it?
Yes, sir. It's difficult what this committee could actually do regarding individual projects. It's just very limited because of the nature of how projects are done. You've got a board of transportation. It's generated from the local NPO and RPO, and it's typically scored, and it's competed against other projects. So I don't think that typically this committee doesn't get involved with individual projects.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's all.
I can recommend that anybody in the General Assembly that wants to develop a rapport with their division engineer and get really good explanations if they're doing a good job. Mine happens to be very responsive. So I can recommend that. This committee itself, we allocate the money, how they spend it sometimes is not perfect, but they'll come back and report to us and the oversight committee, the JLTOC oversight committee, the joint. Representative Shepherd.
Yes, I wanted to follow up on the FTEs. Do we know how long some of those positions have been vacant? I know years ago, there was some vacant for a year to 2 years, and they were still getting funds for those positions, even though there was nobody working in them. So that was my question about the FTEs. And then I have another question.
So Representative Shepherd, so we don't have a figure of the percentages at this time, but we can put that together for you. We also, the General Assembly has acted in previous years to eliminate positions over a certain period of time that have been vacant for a long time.
The next question, Mr. Chair, is
Follow up.
no, this is not follow up on this, it's a new one.
A new
But
question.
anyway, it's I know that when we have hurricanes and so forth down east, and even in the water the floods in the mountains, we spend quite a bit of money in DOT. The last time I was told that even though we have the rainy day funds and so forth, that when DOT goes out and expends money in their districts to take care of the roads and replace those roads and bridges and so forth, when we have floods and those type of things, that we don't get that money back. And I think that was part of the shortfall before, was we were still waiting on the federal money to come down to replace the money they had spent locally. And if Lisa could speak to that, just cover that if you would.
Lisa, got any idea about the emergency spending?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, we will need to get the latest report to find out how much that they're still outstanding. I don't think it's a significant amount from those, but they produce a report periodically. But Mr. Chairman, if you look here at this cash report, there's a lot of cash that has been coming in, and every week it shows the cash that's coming in from the federal receipts and the declared emergencies and so forth. So starting at the top, this is how to look at this report. It starts at the top, the total cash and bond proceeds, that totals 2.7 billion. And then you've got the breakdown of the highway fund and the highway trust fund. And then going down, you see the receipts that came in for the week, the 63.9 million. And then of that, the federal receipts and the emergency declared disaster reimbursements. And then, Nick, if you'll scroll all the way down, then it shows some disbursements that go out. Then it's got your reserved cash. So this is the Garvey, the grants, anticipated revenue vehicles, as well as the federal, let's see, I've lost my place. Okay, so it's got your bonds breaking down. So it's got the transportation emergency reserve, 125 million. And then the build NC, 164.6 million that's sitting there available for use for those statewide transportation improvement projects. And then you've got Garvey, that's unexpended right now of 98.8 million. And so you've got the unreserved cash balance total 2.3 billion, and the breakdown of the highway fund and the highway trust fund. And the highway fund, is now even higher than the highway trust fund amount. Also on this report at the bottom, you've got your statutory cash minimum of 358 million, and then that target that the General Assembly has set for them to be between. So a lot of cash has been coming in different ways. And so we'll have to get the latest report.
Okay, we got to be out of here in 10 till, which is about 3 minutes. I do want to get to last two questions. Representative Austin and Adams next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Two questions. First, for the funding for vacant FTEs, or kind of the funding that goes unspent for FTEs, can that funding be used or reprogrammed